Petrus, and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you watched some of our content so far and liked it, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and donating on Patreon. Today we're talking with Professor Tim Noakes. The professor holds numerous degrees relating to sports sciences and serves as an emeritus professor at UCT, following his retirement from the research unit. In 2008, he received the Order of Mapungubwe, Silver, from the President of South Africa for his contribution to the sciences of physical exercise. The professor has published more than 750 scientific books and articles. The one he's the most famous for, The Real Meal Revolution, which launched the controversial Banting Diet into the public sphere. After the publication of his best-selling book, he founded the Noakes Foundation, which focused on providing high-quality research for his prescribed diet. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Petrus. Lovely to be with you.
Well, we're so happy to talk to you. We've, obviously had a lot of experience. Like many South Africans, I think you need very little introduction in terms of the stuff that you've taught South Africans about, whether it's, whether people think it's good or bad. But just to set the ground for those that might not have heard about you, could you just give us a brief rundown of the Banting Diet so we know what we're talking about?
Absolutely. So up to 2011, I was promoting the high carbohydrate, low fat diet, which I was taught in my medical school, and I had followed for 33 years. Then I discovered a book called The New Atkins for the New You by three guys, of Dr. Eric Westman was the main author. I read it. I originally saw it because it's called The New Atkins for the New You, and I thought, this is terrible. They've sold out to Atkins, who told us to eat saturated fat. That's going to kill us all. So I got so angry because I knew Eric Westman and I knew the other authors and I knew they're good scientists, and I figured they'd sold out. So I thought, like everyone, they eventually sell out for something. So I went and bought the book, and I was really angry, and I opened it, and within 2 hours I said, that's it. I got it all wrong. And so I decided that was the end of carbs for me. So I stopped eating carbohydrates at lunchtime. Yeah. And eventually I lost so much weight that people said, well, have you got cancer? So I said, no, I haven't got cancer. I've just changed my diet. And it was very difficult because they knew I'd promoted this low fat diet for all these years. And eventually I came out and said I'd actually converted to this diet, and that then my problems arose because I was telling the truth, and it was a truth that no one wanted. The profession didn't want to hear it. So I was excommunicated by my university and by my profession, and I had to go through 28 days in court to try and resuscitate and revive my career, because I was being projected as this guy who had broken all the science rules, and the university had kicked me out. And that's what the picture was. And so after 28 days, I won my case, 13 decisions to nil, and kind of resuscitated my scientific career. And since then, it's been amazing. I mean, the evidence is accumulating. Yesterday, there was a paper in one journal, British Medical Journal, saying grains are causing heart disease. And today there was a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, the premier journal in the world, saying that a high carbohydrate load is causing heart disease. Now, that's exactly what I've been saying since 2011.
Yeah, and I actually remember when I was a kid, we used to have those, the food pyramids in our textbooks for life orientation, and it would always be the biggest one at the bottom is just wheats and pastas and stuff like that. So that mentality was well ingrained even when I was still a child. So it's a very established environment to come and break out of. In terms of, you said you read the book and a certain part into the book, you were convinced and thinking, okay, now I need to change on this. Is there something they said specifically as the way that they conveyed their argument, or is the data they had that convinced you that this is worth it?
That's a brilliant question. And the answer was, it was simply the data was there. The studies were there. And I'd never read the studies. So here I am, a scientist trained at the medical school, and I'd never heard of the low carbohydrate diet and the benefits. So it was absolutely astonishing to me that there was the evidence and I'd never been exposed to it. And that's the reality. They were hiding this information that was proving the case for the low carbohydrate diet. And I felt embarrassed that I'd never seen this information, but it is so suppressed. And one of the authors, Jeff Volek, who's done the most research on the low carbohydrate diet, and I was asked to promote him for professor's position. I said, this guy deserves a Nobel Prize because he has clearly shown that the metabolic disorders that we suffer from are caused by high carbohydrate diets. And he's shown with the most meticulous research that you can reverse all these problems with a high fat, low carbohydrate diet.
Mm.
And the Nobel Prize is given to the person who provides the most benefit to the most people. Well, if the most people were to change their diets, we would reverse ill health in billions of people globally.
Mm.
So
Well, and
that's the real thing.
you read the book and you looked at the data, and the first thing you did was you decided, okay, instead of necessarily telling our people, okay, look at the data, this is correct, you first change your own diet. And then only after being on it yourself and losing a lot of weight did you start to tell other people about it. Or like you said, you came out with this other sort of relation that you had. So in that journey itself, was there perhaps a point at where you started the diet where, sure, you looked at the data, but you didn't quite yet believe it until you actually started doing it yourself?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the problem in nutrition science is very simple. There are two types of human beings. There are those who fatten easily, like myself, and those who don't fatten. And those who don't fatten, if they become doctors or dietitians, they have no clue because they say, oh, the reason I'm personally thin is because I'm disciplined and I don't eat excessive this and that and the other, and I exercise vigorously and I keep my calorie balance in. And they don't understand that if you are a fat and easily person, you can do all of those things and you get fat. You do everything they do. And I mean,
Yeah.
I ran 70 marathons and ultra marathons and got fat. Bruce Fordyce, no one in the world has run more marathons than Bruce, and yet he put on 10 kilos or something.
Yeah.
So it's absolute nonsense. So that's the first point. And within a day, I started feeling better. And within the first 6 weeks, I'd lost, I think, about 10 kilos.
Mm.
And I thought, and I'd never been able to control my weight before, and it was a miracle. And my running went back 20 years. I went back to being a 40-year-old at 60. So I knew that something dramatic was happening. But it's so funny, because the first people who attacked me said, Noakes is just an anecdote. He's talking about his own experiences. That's nonsense. I first read the science, then I tried it, and it worked. And what more evidence do you really need than that? The evidence plus your personal experience.
Yeah, it's well, I even go as far as to say you have to have both. It's like if you only read the evidence, but you don't test it for yourself, you just accepted whatever somebody else said at face value. So having both actually provides a stronger argument for you. But I want to ask a question. How exactly did we get to this point, in your opinion, at least? Because I feel like, especially after, I don't know when exactly this started, but definitely, the 1950s to at least the 2000s, the carbo diet really, blew up in terms of what was staply
Yeah.
prescribed to almost every citizen. So why did we ever go on a carbo diet if it's so detrimental? Was there other interests other than nutritional scientific data?
I think they came along later. So
Okay.
what happened in 1953 was Ansel Keys, because he was being sidelined, and there was a guy called John Goffman who had come up with this theory that fat and carbohydrates have caused two different forms of heart disease. But carbohydrates and fats both cause heart disease. And this guy was about to become the hero of nutrition. And Ansel Keys, who was not as well qualified as him, realized that there was an opportunity for him because there was suddenly all this money coming in to research. And one day he opened an advert from the World Health Organization. He saw a graph and he said, there it is, it's saturated fat causing heart disease. And he sold that hypothesis to the world. And he was just a better salesman than Goffman. And within a short time, he'd written Goffman out of history and said it's saturated fat, not sugar or carbohydrates, that are causing heart disease. That was the first thing. The next thing that happened was in 1961, the Procter and Gamble company in Cleveland, Ohio, which were making the vegetable oils. Now, vegetable oils didn't exist before 1910. And then Procter and Gamble ran out of candles. They couldn't make candles anymore because electricity arrived. And they said, well, if we can make candles, we can also make margarine. And they started making the first vegetable oils. And in 1961, they had the brilliant idea that if we fund the American Heart Association to say that vegetable oils are healthy, we'll do well. And they did that. And the American Heart Association in 1961 started promoting vegetable oils as more healthy than saturated fat from the animals that we'd eaten for 3-4 million years. And it was that single event that caused the American Heart Association to start promoting a low-fat diet in which we'd replace saturated fat with vegetable oils. And that's the moment it takes off. And then the US government comes along and produces their dietary guidelines of 1977. And that was drawn up by people with no training in nutrition science whatsoever. And they said we have to have 6 to 11 servings of grains every day, and they changed the dietary guidelines. And from that moment, industry jumped in. And industry had a problem because when you take fat out of food, it tastes terrible. But they realized if you place it with sugar, that's fantastic because sugar is addictive, the most addictive substance on planet Earth. And they just put more and more sugar in. And so they produced this industrial diet. And so the reason it's sustained today is because of the industrial companies producing this industrial diet. And they have control over everyone. They control what's taught in the medical schools. They control the dietitians by funding them. And they try to take me out because I was saying something different.
It is actually, yeah, that's the part that's, I almost want to say, terrifying to people that aren't educated in nutritional science, or not quite as well read about it. It's like everybody has an opinion on what your diet should be this day, and even more fervently in the past couple of years, people defend their diet more so. And just the type of, I almost want to say, leverage that some companies or institutions can have to benefit their production line, or the product they're selling, in the way that they can affect, like for example, mentioned with vegetable oils and the American Heart Association. That's something that's scary to us because we don't know exactly who to trust then, because they're obviously like easily influenceable. Do you think that this type of manipulation is the reason why you received such a negative press about it? Do you think it's manipulation, or just people were just ingrained in the way they thought?
No, there was absolutely behind it. We know that there was an organization called the International Life Sciences Institute, and they were all over my trial.
Right.
And 3 of the major prosecution witnesses were former heads of ILSI and involved with ILSI. So ILSI has a terrible track record when it's being exposed.
Yeah.
And they are a front for sugar and for carbohydrates and for refined foods and for Monsanto and for Pfizer, a whole bunch of companies. And they have absolutely no interest in your health. They're just going to protect those companies. So there's no question that they got to my university, they got to the profession, and they got to the dietitians, and that's where it all came from.
Yeah,
And
that meant. Sorry, continue.
Of course, if we hadn't gone to court, we would never have known that they were behind the thing.
Yeah, that's a perspective that's, I almost want to say, is increasing. I don't know if it's increasing in popularity or not, but it is definitely more. You hear about it more. Is the people that specifically, I mean, they call it big pharma in the USA, but they look at the big pharmacy companies and basically cast them in a form of distrust. It's almost a bit of a cult, movement at this point, which is what's both dragging people to it and keeping people away from it, depending on how extreme they want to have the reaction towards this type of scenario. But in terms of fighting this in a way that's sustainable and will get moderate people across the argument to increasing it, do you think that continue to highlighting these type of scenarios where these companies are not acting in your best interest, is that a good way to go about it, or should people just look at the independent science and then go from that point forward and disregard the big opinions?
Linda, it's like when you introduced me, you said the Banting Diet's controversial. Well, it is controversial because the industry wants it to be controversial. It's not controversial. It's a diet that humans have always eaten. And who made it controversial? Let me explain to you the problem. The problem is the pharmaceutical industry and the diet and the pharmaceutical industry and the food industry controls what's taught at medical schools. That's it.
Right.
And so if I was the dean of medicine at a faculty in South Africa, and I had my feelings now, which I know that 85% of chronic disease, that's the hypertension, the heart disease, the cancers, the obesity, 85% are all due to nutritional problems, and that you cannot cure them with drugs. If I was the dean of medicine and I came up and said, guys, I'm sorry we were wrong, this is all nutritional, and the diet and the pharmacology doesn't work. That would be the end of me, but it would be the end of my faculty as well, because the faculty absolutely can only exist because of the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry knows that. So that's the problem. And so we are going to the medical students are continue to be taught the treatments that don't work because they have to keep keeping people sick, because the pharmaceutical industry cannot make money out of healthy people. And so until people understand that, it's a problem. And then to make people like me a conspiracy theorist, no, I'm just telling you the truth. Whether you accept it or not, that's for you. But I've considered the evidence. No one reads more about nutrition than I do, and in South Africa, and no one understands it better than I do. And what I'm telling you is the truth, and I've written about it, and I won my case. I went to court for 28 days to prove I was right. I proved I was right.
Mm.
And you know what happened at my university? Not one thing changed. If you
Oh,
go to the
really?
website,
Okay.
you go to the website of the dietitians group at the University of Cape Town, there's the guidelines, 75% carbohydrate diet.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's unbelievable.
So you mentioned you're extremely well read up upon this, especially in the South African sphere. How do you feel has the I don't want to make this about politics, but specifically, how do you feel like the government's reaction has been to your diet specifically? Do you believe that because we have a massive like sugar, beer, grain diet that's perpetrated in South Africa? How do you feel like the official reaction has been towards the diet?
Oh, it's just ignore it, completely ignore it. I mean,
Okay.
yesterday, you won't believe it, that the president's wife gave a talk at the University of Cape Town, or hosted by the University of Cape Town, and she was reporting a recent statement by the National Research Foundation that South Africa has a dual problem of childhood obesity and childhood stunting.
Mm.
Now, they're both caused by exactly what I went to court for. I was charged with telling people they should wean onto animal foods. That was Now, if you wean onto animal foods, you do not get stunting and you don't get obesity.
Mm.
So now they're saying, oh, we've got this problem. The solution is very simple. Wean children onto animal foods and you don't have a stunting problem and you don't have obesity. So the solution is there. But you'll see all these people, they come and, oh, we're so concerned about it and we can, but they're not, because we know the solution, but they won't address the solution. They just keep making this is the problem and we don't have a solution.
Yeah. Well, at the very least, they don't explore all of the options.
Yeah, that's right. And the interesting thing is that, do you know what the common symptom for obesity and malnutrition is? It's hunger. How is that? Isn't that interesting that hunger
That's counterintuitive.
is the defining symptom in malnutrition and it's the defining symptom in obesity. And why is it? Because carbohydrates drive hunger. And if you get too many carbohydrates, you eat too much, you're still hungry, but you're fat. If you don't get enough carbohydrates, you're still hungry. So that you've got hunger even and malnutrition.
And like you've mentioned, it's also addictive. Sugar specifically, it's the hunger is an additional symptom of the addiction to sugars.
Absolutely. And that was one of the first things I was criticized by, saying you should eat once a day. And the dietitian said, how can you say that? You've got to eat 6 times a day. Well, if you eat 6 times a day, that's just for the addiction.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So in terms of the connection between, you've already mentioned obesity and stunting and so on and so forth, but specifically in the connection to cancer and Alzheimer's. Apparently, I think Alzheimer's was originally classified as diabetes type 3. What do you think is the connection between sugar and carbs and Alzheimer's and those type of diseases specifically? Is it the same?
Yeah, so they're all related to the condition of insulin resistance. And I have insulin resistance. And that's why I developed type 2 diabetes. And I've been able to reverse my diabetes, but I haven't reversed the insulin resistance. I'm as insulin resistant today as I was when I was first diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. The key in insulin resistance is you don't eat carbohydrates and then you're fine. Then there's no complications. It's the carbohydrates that drive the problem. Now, insulin resistance is the most prevalent medical condition in the world. It underlies all these chronic diseases, and we do not teach it in medical schools. Not one medical school teaches it around them. There are a couple of doctors like myself who are teaching insulin resistance at certain medical schools, but is not part of the core curriculum. So isn't that astonishing? The most prevalent condition is not taught at the medical schools. And that's because it's a problem, because we've been teaching this cholesterol, saturated fat, heart disease theme when it's not true. Heart disease is caused by diabetes and insulin resistance. It should be called diabetic heart disease. And then we start focusing on the issue. And diabetes is caused by high carbohydrate diets in people eating, with people who are insulin resistant, eating a high carbohydrate diet. So there's a solution. Don't eat carbohydrates if you're insulin resistant. Problem solved.
Yeah. But also there's also the connection, like you've previously mentioned, in terms of who's funding this research is the pharmaceutical companies that make one of the biggest medical industries in the world is the insulin injection industries. Especially, I know, for example, in the US, you have stupid numbers for their medical system that people have to pay for a mandatory, something either live or die without it, insulin injections. So there's a lot of money under, supporting that concept.
Yeah, absolutely. So insulin in America costs $1,000 a month. $1,000, that's nearly 15,000 Rand a month. And that's life-saving. It's life-saving in type 1 diabetes, but in type 2 diabetes, it just makes the condition worse. And we know from the Virta health studies, and maybe we'll discuss them later, that 90% of patients can come off their insulin if they go on a low carbohydrate diet. So that's the issue. You could save yourself 14,000 Rand a month by just eating a low carbohydrate diet.
We'll definitely talk about the financial aspect of Banting a bit later in terms of marketing, because I think that's also something that people use as a counter argument. But I just want to first pick on the biggest counter argument that people have for the Banting diet is, of course, that they connect fats, or rather saturated fats, directly with cholesterol levels and heart disease. And this is something that whenever you go to your GP and they do your cholesterol tests and it's a bit high, it's seen as this doomsday prediction for you. What do you say about the connection specifically between saturated fats and cholesterol?
There is no connection. There is no connection between saturated fat and heart disease, and there's no connection between blood cholesterol concentrations and heart disease. There is one measure, which is your oxidized LDL cholesterol, which has there's a slight relationship to heart disease. Heart disease is caused by diabetes. Heart disease is caused by insulin resistance and high carbohydrate diets, and that's universally true. So yesterday, British Medical Journal paper comes out saying grains are causing heart disease. Today in the New England Journal of Medicine, high carbohydrate loads are causing heart disease. So please, it's time we moved on. The answer was that Ansel Keys' idea was accepted. It then spurned this whole statin industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. And statins essentially make no difference. They help 1 in 100 people, 1 in 100 people at best, at very best. And if you're a woman, it's probably 1 in 1,000. But the patients are never told that. Why not? Because we've got this model. This model is that you eat saturated fat, your cholesterol rises, and you drop dead the next day. And that model is totally, utterly, completely wrong. You eat carbohydrates, you raise your glucose, you raise your insulin, you raise your triglycerides, you lower your HDL cholesterol, you get a fatty liver, your body becomes inflamed. That inflammation causes the arterial disease. And that's the truth. But we don't teach that at medical school because that's too difficult to understand. We can't teach the public that as your fat cells get bigger, this is the visceral fat cells in the intestine, in the gut. As they get bigger, they start to release cytokines, which are an inflammatory response, and that your body becomes inflamed. And then the COVID-19 hits you, and that you become an inflammatory disaster. We can't, that's too complex to teach. We must teach them it's cholesterol, and if cholesterol rises and you get heart disease and you die. That's easy, and that's easy for people to understand, but it's wrong. It's completely, utterly wrong.
And also, I think there's also an element towards the granularity of cholesterol tests that's being done today. In terms of when you get a very basic cholesterol test, it doesn't test exactly what type of fats are in your system that affect these type of factors or not. It just treats you as a very, very platonic perception of what fats exist in your system. And therefore, it just looks bad at from the beginning, or it looks bad at first sight because the test is not, granular or detailed enough. So perhaps more accurate testing could solve this misconception?
Yeah, the best test is you take 75 grams of glucose, you swallow it, and you measure your insulin 2 hours later. And if your insulin is elevated, you are on the road for diabetes and heart disease. That's a test. But no one does that. No one tests insulin after a glucose challenge. They measure glucose and think that's enough. It's not. But the best marker is your HDL to triglyceride ratio. And because the HDL cholesterol goes up if you're eating a nice heavy fat diet and you're not insulin resistant, and your triglycerides go down. And that ratio is the best predictor other than diabetes. Diabetes remains the best predictor. And what's the best predictor of death from COVID-19? In South Africa, it's diabetes. Your risk of a fatal outcome is 12-fold greater, 12-fold increased. Now, I'll tell you how much that means. Smoking, we accept that smoking causes lung cancer on the grounds that smokers have a 2-fold increased risk of cancer. This is a 12-fold increased risk. But have you heard anyone say COVID-19 people, we should be eating less carbohydrates. Not at all.
Mm,
And the
mm,
biggest predictor of COVID deaths is how much fat sits in your abdomen.
mm,
And that's all coming directly from carbohydrates.
mm,
So,
mm,
so that's the evidence. It is absolutely compelling.
mm, mm,
But as we've described, that's going to take 20 years for the arrogant people who cannot admit they were wrong.
mm.
They will be teaching the same stuff for 20 years' time, and eventually they'll be replaced. And the funerals, as they said, we go from funeral to funeral, and eventually we get to the truth.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's also another, I want to say, from the people that aren't necessarily in medical school. There's definitely a different, like, encouraging element when it comes to not doing a Banting diet, doing a carb diet, and that is that carbs are incredibly cheap. It's incredibly cheap to live off of 2-minute noodles and pastas and stuff like that, and bread and so on and so forth. These are even very well subsidized by the state, whereas other things that are very good for Banting, like, meats and avocados and stuff like that, obviously isn't. This has to do with, the mentality around what's the prescribed diet, of course, but also on the other hand, it's just more expensive to produce. So do you think that if this becomes a more mainstream diet, that the economies of scale will kick in and Banting diet will become cheaper if it receives the same production capabilities as traditional foods? For example, if xylitol to become less expensive than sugar, as an example.
Yeah. Well, you can live on the Banting diet for 3 rand a day in South Africa. Do you hear that?
Yeah.
Sorry, not
I've
3
read
rand,
about
30
it.
rand. 30 rand, sorry, 30 rand a day. And we
Yeah.
have an Eat Better South Africa campaign in my foundation. And you won't eat great, it won't be a great variety, but you can eat on that.
Mm,
And so it is possible because you just eat tinned meats and tinned fish and
mm,
eggs and dairy, and
mm,
and a little bit of vegetables.
mm,
And then you go and find your fat where the fat's thrown away at the supermarket, so you go and find it there. So you can do it very cheaply, but of course that's not going to be. But
very
people don't
interesting.
understand. If you go and see how much you spend on cokes and chips and chocolates,
Mm,
but oh, that's not food. You see, that's not the food.
mm.
But when you add it all up, a lot of people have said that the diet is cheaper than their diet that they were eating beforehand.
And of course, it's also a lot cheaper than, especially for people living with diabetes, it's a lot cheaper than paying monthly for insulin, for example. But,
Let me add one more point. One of the
right.
reasons why I'm so strongly about this diet is I watched my dad die from type 2 diabetes.
Mm,
And that is an experience no one wants to go through. It is
yes.
too appalling for my father. And one of the reasons I went on this diet, because I knew when I had type 2 diabetes, I didn't want to die in 10 years' time. I'm
Mm,
now 11 years outside. I've had the disease for 11 years. So I should be dead, but
mm,
fortunately, I'm not. But I didn't want to put my grandchildren and my children through observing me dying and just
mm,
becoming a non-person. And that,
mm,
I think that you owe your children something as well. You've got to look after your health as best you can.
mm,
And I just know I'm 71 and a half now. And there's only one way I can sustain my health, and that's by eating a lot of fat and a lot of protein and
mm.
no carbohydrates and no sugar and no vegetable oils.
And it's a great motivator. I also had my grandma on my mother's side. She had cancer in her final days, and she decided she had a wonderful life and a wonderful connection with her children. And at that point, she didn't want to go for chemo, which I understand completely other people need, but she wanted to live a healthy life and extend her life with as much as possible by natural means, just so that she doesn't have to be in a hospital suffering through chemo with the last days with her children. So in terms of how a battle is being fought, it's both the interest of how you want to live your life, and also, of course, the sustainable. In your case, that's a sustainable way for you to fight disease and live much longer. She ended up outliving her predicted lifetime by about a year. So I mean, that's a year we got by, which we maybe couldn't have, maybe could have. It's unknown. But specifically in terms of what we talked about earlier, it's like marketing is a massive thing with this, in terms of like public perception. It's like how the diet is marketed. And it's interesting to me because it's actually a weird argument to make. In normal cases where something is quite obviously better, it's because of a lack of marketing that is not popular. But Banting does have a ton of marketing. There's like a ton of restaurants and products that are being supplied for this. perhaps if it was, one suggestion that I could make from my uneducated experience, is that perhaps the Banting diet could be marketed as healthy instead of like a lifestyle choice. People think at the moment Banting is like a complete lifestyle choice. I'm not saying it's not. It's just that if you make it as a health argument, then perhaps you don't have to, use Banting tomato sauce because you're Banting, but you could use the Banting tomato sauce because it's just healthier. So is that perhaps a tactic, or is that already being employed already?
Yeah, I agree that that would be nice for us to promote it as a healthy diet. The problem is that not everyone considers their health as being important. We have
Really?
normalized obesity and we've normalized this dreadful diet, this industrial diet. When I matriculated in 1966, every kid in the class except one was lean, but really lean. And
Mm,
the same with the girls at the other schools. Everyone was lean. So I come from an environment of knowing what leanness looks like. And now it's the opposite. The obesity is the standard, it's the norm.
mm,
And it's very difficult for people who are obese to think, well, actually, I'm not healthy
mm,
because everyone looks like me and then everyone's eating the same diet. So
mm,
that's the first problem. People don't understand what health is, and they don't understand what ill health, what the consequences of ill health are. And I just look around at the people my age and I just see those who've been eating grains and cereals and grains, they start to wear out at about 70, and they from there on they're going downhill very quickly.
mm,
And it's absolutely remarkable to see it and just to notice what happens. The dementia starts to forget about the heart disease. The heart disease is
yeah.
good because it knocks you off immediately.
Mm,
But you see the dementias and the cancers
yeah.
and the osteoporosis people, and then the loss of muscle bulk, the sarcopenia,
Yeah.
and they get this dead man's curve, which is like this,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they can't get away from that, and that's terrible, and that's all preventable by eating a decent diet and doing a decent bit of heavy exercise.
Mm. In terms of what to eat, I also feel like it would be reminiscent to not talk about, I'm going to say, the Afrikaans elephant in the room. In Afrikaans and in different cultures around the world, there is this culture that, you have to eat your groente, like eat your vegetables, right? And then you'll
Yeah.
grow up big and strong. And you recently, if I remember correctly, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, said that you don't even need to eat vegetables for the Banting diet. In terms of this cultural difference and perhaps, going in the face of that type of mentality, how do you respond to that in terms of like, we'll go into the different elements of
Yeah.
why vegetables might be cheaper or the environmental concept, but just that you don't really need to eat vegetables, only meats.
Yeah, because there's a complete fallacy that vegetables are full of nutrients. It's meat that is full of nutrients, and fish, and dairy, and
Mm,
eggs. And eggs are the most nutrient, and livers. That's where you find your nutrients. But unfortunately, whenever you see a dietitian, go on their website, all you see is fruit and vegetables, as if
mm,
that's healthy. It's not. That's just a load of sugar, a load of carbohydrate with very low nutrients. So
mm,
that it's a great problem for us. What you need to see is eggs, fish, meat,
mm,
dairy, and nuts.
mm,
Those are the nutrient dense foods.
mm.
But no dietitian does it, because if they were to do that, they'd be
Villainized.
excommunicated.
Mm,
They'd be,
mm. I
yeah,
was I was vegetarian myself for or rather I should say pescatarian, because I still ate fish for about 6 years. And initially it gained me wonderful results, perhaps just because of the difference, the change in diet and the change in pacing when you need to eat vastly different foods. But in the end, I still switched back to a normal diet, not Banting yet, but a normal diet with meats and so on and so forth, because it's just started to not yield the same results as it did about in year 1 or 2. But in
yeah.
terms of whether it's detrimental for you or not, like we know definitely, we understand your stance on sugars and carbs, for example, but is it detrimental at all to add vegetables to it, and just in terms of variety or interestingness, or do you
Oh, no,
just
not
feel
at
like you should
all.
promote?
Not at all. But there are some people who are sensitive to lectins, probably. There are certain poisons or chemicals in vegetables that can harm certain people. And we see autoimmune disease, at least I see it as a reflection of there's something wrong in the vegetables that you eat. And people can cure themselves dramatically of some autoimmune diseases. Not everyone and not all autoimmune diseases, but you get these dramatic changes when they cut out the vegetables. I just want to come back to one little point.
Yeah.
That's so funny. There was a tweet yesterday, and it was a story from 1890, and it says the Boere are giants. This is a
Okay.
report. This is a report in an English newspaper.
Mm,
And they said the Afrikaners in South Africa average height is 6'2". They are giants because they eat meat all the time.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it's absolutely true. You look at the South African forwards over the years, where have they come from? They've been farmers' children who were
Mm,
raised on the farm eating all the foods that we talk about.
mm.
And that's what made South African rugby great, was the huge Afrikaner forwards who'd been raised on meat. And now we want to raise our Afrikaans forwards on cereals and grains. It'll be the end of South African rugby.
Yeah, as we know it, of course. I mean, it's also, I feel like that's a scenario we know quite, really, really well. It's the, what do you do for a snack in Afrikaans farm households? You eat biltong. It's
Yeah.
like nobody eats an apple, exactly. So yeah, that scenario exists as well. But I think it's really important and good that people know that it's not like vegetables aren't the damning thing. The carbs and the sugars are the damning thing. So you can make your diet interesting and fun with both meats and vegetables. It's just where you allocate those resources in terms of where you get your energy from. That's support that you support more. In that regard, sorry.
The problem, say I could be a vegetarian drinking Coke and eating chips all
Yes.
day and eating fruit, and that is a toxic, it couldn't be a more toxic diet. And that's the problem.
Mm,
If you eat real foods as a vegetarian, fantastic. But
mm.
it's so easy to slip and become a pizza eater and bread eater, and you won't be healthy in the long term if you eat like that.
Well, I'll be honest, from my very own experience, it's just that you don't really find non-meat diets when I was a vegetarian. You've lacked something that gives you sustenance that gets you through the day in the long run. So
Yeah.
then it's very, very easy to default to breads and pizzas and cereals and so on and so forth, to get you through the day, because you do need the energy. I still ate, of course, eggs and stuff like that, which I found to be wonderful boosts in terms of the contents, because I looked at going vegan as well for an experiment basis for health reasons, and just giving up eggs alone. I read the requirements of other things you had to eat to supplement eggs, and it's like a mile-long list.
That's right.
But I want to touch specifically on, because this is such a core issue that's important to a lot of people that can afford and want to do the Banting diet, and that is the environmental effect. So there is a direct correlation, good science between, the produce of animal foods, animal fats, animal products, milk, and so on and so forth, with how much carbon emissions and effect it has on climate change. Of course, there's a lot of supplements that, in terms of beans and stuff like that, give a similar, I don't want to say the same, but a similar type of nutritional value, but that's probably more expensive because the technology isn't quite as advanced. What's your response in terms of both the environmental effect and also the possible supplements for people that want to be environmentally conscious in terms of how they go about their Banting diet?
Yeah, I think you have to look at what you mean by climate change. What exactly is it? I just no longer follow the mainstream media, because what they do is they say, here's climate change, and then they say, this is an example of climate change. But no one defines to me what exactly is climate change. That's point one. Point two is when they look at the emissions, they don't look at the totality of the picture. And if you don't have animals to fertilize the land, you're destroying everything. And if you go to the Midwest, you'll see that the topsoil is now like this. It used to be meters thick. It is now like this. And when that topsoil's gone, then we're not going to have any plants, any more cereals and grains to eat. So it's a very, very complex issue, and it's become so politicized that the truth doesn't come out.
Right.
There's a lovely book just published called Sacred Cow, which is a very important book, which looks at both arguments and comes to the conclusion that there is no real evidence that stopping eating meat is going to help. Because what's going to happen? We're going to get a lot of sick people. And what's the environmental cost to that? So it's too simplified. I don't enter the debate. I just say, think about it and read about it, and realize that it is largely the emissions from the oil industry. That's what's causing. If there is climate change, that's what's causing it. But you have to understand that climate change is making a lot of money for a lot of people. And it's a financially driven phenomenon, just like the vaccine for the COVID-19 vaccine. COVID was never about COVID, it was about the vaccine. Now they've got the vaccine, they've generated $19 billion in sales for two pharmaceutical companies within 1 year. $19 billion has been transferred to the pharmaceutical industries from your taxes and my taxes. And that's what you've got to be very wary, that a lot of these things that are promoted by the mainstream media are diverting money from one group of people to the other.
I also just want to point out in regards to the argument for the different type of emissions, there's a video I want to recommend to you and also all the rest of the viewers by Simon Clark, who's a meteorologist. Sorry, he's a doctorate in climate science. And he did a study on terms of what the different emissions are, where the groups are coming from, and what are the contributing factors to it. I can't exactly remember the name of it now, but the vast majority is still the power sector and the air travel sector in terms of how the emissions are. He himself is a vegetarian because of what the the effect is in terms of what the data says is the contribution of farming to climate change, but it is still a very small percentage. He himself says you can do this to make a difference in terms of your own regard, but there's a lot bigger, there's a lot bigger fish to hunt in terms of making a change in that environment. Lastly, I just want to ask for how long do you think, because I mean, you said it takes 20 years for this mentality of carbs and sugar and so to die. It'll take about 20 years. How long do you think it'll take for the Banting diet to really pick up the speed and tempo it needs to change the worldwide diet and obesity pandemic that we basically have going on? Do you feel it's sustainable? Do you think it's possible for the world to change around it?
I don't see it happening. Robert Lustig is one of my great heroes. He's taken on the sugar industry, written some fantastic books. And I was in a discussion with him, and he said, we're in year 7 of a 20-year project. It's going to take another 13 years. I wonder if we'll ever get there. I just, the way the humans are being controlled by the mainstream media and being taught a load of rubbish that is not true. Truth just doesn't exist anymore. And that's the problem. I have a great fear, and I talk to intelligent people, and they don't see through what's happening. So I'm reluctant to think that there will be a change even within 20 years.
Perhaps for a more positive perspective on it, if you're in a 7-year of the 20-year program, do you believe that the truth usually wins out in the end?
It does in a democracy.
Okay.
It does in a democracy, but we are moving away from democracy towards socialism and fascism. And it's happening very quickly in the United States of America. And that's a real worry, because if they fall, who does it leave? Britain's gone, as far as I see. With the way they've managed their COVID, they've taken all the freedoms from the people, and the people haven't responded. They've just allowed it to happen.
So if do you think in that regard, sorry, we're extending this last question quite a long way, but do you think in that regard it might be some of the biggest obstacles in terms of how people move on to this type of diet, or even just the mentality in which it works in the end, the way that truth always wins out?
Yeah, so I wish if truth was going to win out, and 10 years ago I would have thought, well, truth always wins out. But what's happened in the last year, the fact that so much untruth has been accepted as true by the general public, and they've stopped thinking, that's a great worry for me.
So is the perhaps the one thing we could do to help the situation is that to encourage people to think, is that to encourage people to stand up and protest against this? What exactly do you feel is a thing that we could do to not only get, Banting Diet's facts out, or also just getting the truth out about any matter?
Yeah, we need a revolution. I mean, people have just got to say, listen, you cannot take any more of my freedoms. You've taken enough. I've had enough. And we have to have a full investigation into this whole COVID story. And that will start. Then people will say, gosh, I never knew that X, Y, and Z. Because I was told this by the experts, but it's now that they were being paid by industry to make sure they said that. So I think that if we see some truth come out of the COVID experience, maybe we can move forward. But I frankly think that governments have to change. That people have to vote out the governments who put us in the position. I didn't lose my job because of lockdown. If I'd lost my job, I would not be supporting any government that organized lockdown. And so that if I was in Britain, I would be starting the anti-lockdown party. And I think that'll happen. And maybe people will get fed up and realize how they've been misled by the politicians all the politicians are making money out of this thing. It's too appalling when you see it.
Well, that's the hope, at least, that people,
Yeah,
the discussion is being had,
yeah,
is continue happening and will happen forever, and get to people that are moderate and perhaps just letting this slide, that don't want to have an opinion because it's too much effort to have one, to
yeah.
stand up for what they believe in. At the very least, that's I want to say what we're hoping to do is just get the discussion going, get as many perspectives out. So we just want to thank you so much. Is there a last opportunity to add anything else you want to add?
No, well, thank you very much for this discussion. And I think it's been a wide-ranging talk.
Hmm.
And some people think I'm controversial, but literally no one studies a topic as thoroughly as I do and then come to the conclusions. And
Hmm.
I wrote a book called Challenging Beliefs, which looks at I challenged 6 ideas and I was right on all of them. And every single one I was demonized for
Hmm.
saying it. It was
Hmm.
all wrong. And
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, let's go back to the 2007 Rugby World Cup when I helped Jake White and told him you have to rest the players. And he believed me and he rested the players. But the whole of South Africa said, how can you do this? Blah, blah. And then
Hmm.
he almost lost his job because
Yeah.
he kept back a whole bunch of players. But I knew from all the experience I'd had in sport and my own experiences helping athletes, you,
Hmm.
you can't win the Rugby World Cup if you've had a tough season leading into it. And
Hmm.
so we changed that and they won. And
Hmm.
so those sorts of things I study very, very carefully.
Hmm.
And I don't make statements freely and easily. If I'd make a statement, I've thought about it and I've looked at the evidence and I've considered the evidence from all sides.
Hmm.
And that's the key. You have to look at all the sides of the evidence. You can't
Hmm.
just look at this little bit that you're being told.
Hmm.
You've got to look at all the evidence. And so that's what I've tried to do.
Hmm.
And the Banting diet is what humans ate for the last 4 million years. We've adapted to this diet. We
Yeah.
are eaters of saturated fat.
Hmm.
And grains came in 12 to 18,000 years ago,
Hmm.
and they started the problem in our decline of health.
Hmm.
And then what, as we spoke about earlier, what happened in the after 1880. So let's just go back. My great great grandmother
Hmm.
was living in Victorian England, and they were the healthiest population that's ever been in Britain.
Hmm.
They had all the real foods that the Banting diet prescribes, and they had no chronic diseases.
Hmm.
They died of infections and trauma, no heart
Hmm.
disease, no diabetes, no obesity. That began to change in the 1870s when the first imports of tinned foods and tinned condensed milk and sugar came into the
Hmm.
diet.
Hmm.
And that is the time when the health of the world changes.
Hmm.
It was when this diet changed
Yeah.
completely
Yeah.
from animal-based foods to all these made-up foods.
Well, we'll definitely have links to your resources, your websites, and so on and so forth in the description below for anybody that wants to further research this or contact you to talk about more about this. We just want to, from our side, thank you so much for talking to us. It's a very, very interesting, very inspiring talk, and we hope this, generates discussion as well. Both ways discussion is important to be had in the first place, because with silence comes, the overthrow of pretty much everything that we believe to be good. So that's the idea here. For our viewers, if you've made it thus far in the video, you most definitely enjoyed it. So in terms of spreading not only Professor Noakes' message, but also, helping out the channel in regard to getting more perspectives to more people's worldviews, please consider liking, sharing this video, and subscribing for any more content. And of course, anything needs to be funded. There's a profit in any way. So in that regard, please consider donating on our Patreon, which supports this channel and allows us to talk to more people more frequently. So Professor, thank you so much again for talking to us. This has been WorldView.